It is an honor for me to have this first seminar in Spanish at Woolf University. There are already several seminars that deal with post-Kantian philosophy, and this would be the first seminar we have on a branch that will be the first of many, right? And Alvaro is, let's say, a first-rate presenter for this. Now I will introduce him to talk about law and politics from the perspective of political theory and technologies. I want to introduce Alvaro. He is a researcher in philosophy and theory of law at the Complutense University of Madrid, and his focus is on new technologies and biotechnology. He holds distinguished bachelor's degrees in both law and philosophy from the very same highly reputable Complutense University. Additionally, he possesses a comprehensive master's degree in auditing and advanced accounting. This particular master's degree was obtained from the esteemed General Council of Economists. He contributes to, and as I understand, collaborates with the Juan de Mariana Institute and is also a postgraduate professor at UCEMA. Well, without further ado, Alvaro, I'll hand the mic over to you so we can talk about how the world is changing, right? How can you explain to us how the world is changing from a technological perspective, especially with technologies like Bitcoin, right? Which, as we know very well, has a much greater impact than just technology itself, but maybe you can explain more to us in this regard. And the world of localities, right? Of the local, of the municipal, as I understand it, as a crisis of the nation state.
Fantastic. Well, it's truly a pleasure to be here. This is going to be one of the most philosophical talks I hope to give, more legal in nature than others. Normally, I tend to talk a lot about Bitcoin and other topics, but what interests me is not just talking about Bitcoin, but above all, discussing political philosophy and philosophy of law as well, which are somewhat my areas of expertise, although many people don't know that, right? Well, the first thing is to understand that the state is a very specific form of political organization, right? Here, I think the main author to study in order to understand this is Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt has an article called The State as a Concrete Concept Linked to a Historical Epoch, which is a very brief article that explains how the state originated in the 16th century, and yet, given the scope and hegemony it has achieved by becoming universal, right? That is to say, all current political forms are state-based, since we have tended to confuse any past political form before the state with states, right? It's as if, in some way, the statist view of politics has infected every past political form that existed before the state. So, in a way, this virus, which I have called statism, and statism is not about worshiping the state. Statism is thinking that any form of political organization is a state, right? That is, it's thinking of the Greek polis and assuming they were states, thinking of Rome and assuming it was a state, thinking of the Hispanic monarchy and assuming it was a state, thinking of the Italian lordships of the Middle Ages and assuming they were states, right? No, they weren't city states, they weren't states, they weren't anything like a state. And to understand this, we need to take a brief historical overview, which is very well explained through the classic distinction between auctoritas and potestas, right? Authority is socially recognized knowledge, and potestas is socially recognized power. Historically, these two institutions have been very clearly differentiated. For example, in the Greek polis, there was an authority that was hegemonic, which was the Oracle of Delphi, and it was Panhellenic, meaning it brought together all the city-states. And the polis were like independent political entities. New ones were founded without any problem, but they represented potestas. The monarchs, the kings, the different forms of government lacked authority. They did not possess a socially recognized knowledge as we understand it today. And to illustrate this, I usually give the example of when Leonidas, the king of Sparta, in the movie 300, has to declare war on Xerxes. He can't do it on his own. He has to go ask the Oracle of Delphi for permission. Notice this. The king of the main military polis, right? Of the Spartans can't go to war whenever he wants. He has to go ask for permission. What a concept, isn't it? Political power has to go ask permission from the socially recognized knowledge, which itself has no power, no force, no armies. The only thing it has is being that institution which people recognize as wise, as an authority, right? And this has historically shaped, well, essentially political relationships. So this is also very evident in Rome. In Greece, there wasn't law in the proper sense. In Greece, there were systems of justice, of course. The trial of Socrates, just to name one example, right? But there wasn't a system that structured legal solutions for specific cases, right? In a way, you could say it's like before the development of medicine. Of course, there were certain attempts to heal, there were certain practices, certain techniques, certain things, but a systematic and structured approach to medical care hadn't been developed yet, right? Well, with law, it's somewhat the same. Before Rome, there wasn't a developed legal system. There were systems of justice that tried to resolve the conflicts that arose, but not based on concrete theories. And this is very well thought out and well developed by all of Roman law, which is precisely what the Roman Empire needed to reorganize and organize all its provinces, right? That is to say, they couldn't establish a series of ways to resolve things unless they were decentralized in some way, which is how they managed to resolve issues through legal experts. In other words, in the end, look at that, right? In Rome, power makes the law, but authority is what creates the legal system. Law in Rome doesn't come from political power, it comes from the legal experts. They are the ones who determine what is just in each specific case. And the judges, in many cases, were lay people who didn't even know the law. So just think about how remarkable that is, right? Notice how striking it is that political power, the law, the IUS, was something different from the lex. It wasn't subsumed, the judges didn't have to say what the political power dictated in order to resolve a specific case. The judges would go consult the legal experts. They were the ones invested with the authority to know what should be given to each person in a particular case, right? And this is jurisprudence, and that was the essence of the law. That was the essence of Roman law, jurisprudence, doing justice in each specific case, continually improving and adapting solutions of justice to the evolution of human, political, and social reality. And that was basically it. When Justinian, at the end of the empire, well, at the end of the Roman era, found himself in the position of having to compile the jurisprudence, that is, all that Roman knowledge that had been developed, he tried to gather it all together. What happens then? The great advantage of Roman law was not the rulings that were issued, nor was it the jurisprudence produced there, but rather the method. The method of addressing the specific reality in order to deliver justice in each particular case. So, when those legal solutions were crystallized, it was thought eventually, when they were later discovered by the glossators of Bologna, which was much later, after all of Justinian's treatise, all the work, the entire compilation, the whole code, there was a very significant problem. It was taken as the canon of law, just as the Bible was being studied with commentaries in a dogmatic way. That body of law compiled by Justinian was taken as the Bible of law. And this presents a problem, which is that the essence of Roman law was not it wasn't those rulings. Those were the product, the fruits, but not the sap that nourished the tree of Roman law. And that's the problem. In the end, what we're left with is just an image, not the entire continuity and flow. And from there, in Europe and really in the rest of the world, since law ultimately comes from the European tradition, we've built a vision of law that is, well, textual, right? And this somewhat lays the groundwork for law, the knowledge of what should be given to each person in a specific case, to gradually dissolve into the law itself, doesn't it? These are essentially the foundations that are being laid and that are taking shape in Europe. So the School of Lawyers in Bologna did just that. They wrote glosses on all the work that Justinian had done. And of course, in the end, this was a mess because it was literally like making commentaries on the Bible, right? And studying that and doing those kinds of things. They weren't seeking justice for the specific case. They were trying to adapt solutions of justice from many centuries ago to the current reality. And that's already a complete distortion of the Roman law method, isn't it? And you might say, what does all this have to do with Bitcoin and with, well, it does have something to do with it. Trust me, it has a lot to do with it, right? So, of course, notice how, as this whole process unfolds, what happens is a process of the positivization of law, right? It becomes tied to the idea that law is not a matter of authorities, but of texts. This is a problem. Why? Well, because precisely another process is going to take place, which is the process of rupture, because I don't like to talk about reform. There is no Protestant Reformation, there is a rupture. What Luther does is break away from the church. So in this rupture, what ultimately happens is that, in a way, he attributes certain properties to the only thing that can be anchored. Once the authority of the church is removed, the only thing he can appeal to is the authority of the text, the authority of the text. And this synergy, this mentality, this worldview that is taking shape in the Middle Ages, well, actually, as the Middle Ages are left behind and the foundations of modern mentality are being laid, ends up subsuming law into legislation, ends up subsuming law into the laws issued by political power, right? This process, well, goes through a series of stages, right? Which ultimately culminate in what is truly the state. Because notice that in the distinction between authority and power, in Rome, the law was not made by political power. nor was it the case in the Hispanic monarchy, because the Hispanic monarchy had a very peculiar and fascinating legal political situation, which is key to understanding what we are going to discuss in this seminar. What happened in Spain? In Spain, specifically in the year 711, the Muslim forces known as the Moors, who originated from North Africa, launched a significant invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. They managed to practically reach the northernmost regions of the peninsula, establishing a considerable presence. And what happens then? That in the north, only the Christian kings remained, and they had to come up with something to start the Reconquista. And they came up with a solution. That solution was the fueros, which at that time were not called fueros as such, but were known as population charters. And what were the population charters? Well, the population charters were basically, look, we need to repopulate the front. We need to bring soldiers, people, and citizens to the frontier. They weren't strictly called frontiers, right? Rather, it was the limes, the border area, the zone where there was conflict. We tried to repopulate in order to begin a conquest. How are we going to be able to do that? Well, to do that, we have to offer really big advantages to people so they'll move to those areas. Why? Because there they're going to face conflict, assaults, robberies, and other kinds of things, right? So what did they do? Well, they gave out portions of land, housing, exemption from taxes, and exemption from certain crimes. In other words, they offered certain legal advantages to those who moved there. Fantastic. The process of repopulation began, people started to be brought in, and progress was made. What happens then? When the frontier moves forward, people don't want to leave the place where they already have those legal advantages. They don't want to move to the next frontier, they want to stay where they are. So since people want to stay there, in order to get them to move to the next frontier, the conditions have to be even better. And in this process of issuing settlement charters, where the conditions kept improving significantly, there was, of course, a huge growth, right? A huge number of people were attracted, a great deal of wealth was drawn in because all the conditions had to become increasingly advantageous. And it was an enormous explosion, not just of wealth, but also of strength and population. And that was essentially what made the Reconquista possible, right? This legal political structure was quite peculiar because, of course, since people no longer wanted to leave the place where they had been granted that settlement charter, they began to govern themselves legally according to their own rules, according to their own way of seeing life. And this eventually crystallized into the fueros. And the fueros are nothing more than that: legal freedom, but not political freedom, judicial autonomy. There were different civil, procedural, and criminal laws in neighboring territories. And this was under the same forms of government, which were the Christian monarchies, right? And this persisted until the arrival of the Bourbons in Spain in the 18th century. All right? So it's something that lasted for centuries, many centuries, okay? And this legal form closely resembles that essence of Roman law, that essence of doing justice in a specific case, because here it was reflected in a way of delivering justice in a particular case, but in very small regions, right? Regionalist, if you will. Those were the fueros. Hey, so here we have our own way of handling inheritances, our own way of dealing with criminal law, our own way of managing procedural law. And why does the king have to get involved in this? It's just that, I mean, it's something that in principle doesn't really concern him, right? And they didn't get involved. In fact, the Hispanic monarchy submitted to the authority of the church. How did it submit to the authority of the church? Well, think about it, right? The territories in America, who decided which king or which monarch those territories in America belonged to? The papal bulls. It is the Pope who sets the boundaries between empires. This is an acknowledgement of the church's authority. That's right, isn't it? Of course, with Luther's movement, what ultimately happens is the end of the church's authority. And if the church's authority is left in no man's land, in some countries, who is going to take up that authority? Who is going to take on that socially recognized knowledge? Well, the monarchies. What the monarchies are going to do is become absolute monarchies because they will absorb the authority of the church. A very clear example of this was Henry VIII, right? I mean, in the end, what Henry VIII did was refused to recognize the authority of the church because he wanted to separate and the church wouldn't allow it. It's that simple, isn't it? Not recognizing the authority of the church. And of course, the church, which had an extremely extensive legal and territorial structure, well, when the monarchies absorbed that authority, they became a power apparatus we had never seen before. Because historically, there had never been power structures that combined power with authority. And that apparatus of power is what ultimately crystallizes into the state when you have to exercise both authority and power together. That's sovereignty, because sovereignty is nothing more than absolute control over a territory. And notice that the church had authority over areas that were not its own territory. But now that's not the case. Now it's an authority limited to the territory. And the development of sovereignty is what ultimately crystallizes into states, into those juridical, political apparatuses that have absolute power and authority over the territory. So, of course, if sovereignty has that absolute control over the territory, how could it allow jurisdictions outside the sovereign's authority? How could it allow independent jurisdictions, that is, their own ways of making law within a political territory controlled by a state? For the state mentality, that is unthinkable. And yet, before the state mentality, it was normal, common, widespread in empires, in monarchies everywhere. And today, trying to talk about this is extremely complicated because when we look at the past, we always see it through lenses that force us to interpret all of history in a statist way. That's why breaking free from that statism, from that state-centered mindset, is essential, right? Then, after this whole process, in the end, the monarchies fall, and they fall in favor of political nations. But political nations are no less sovereign. Political nations inherit all the privileges of absolute monarchies and are just as sovereign over their territory as the monarchs were in their time. So we haven't really moved away from that absolutism. The only difference is that now that absolutism is shared among more people, right? But the absolutist logic itself hasn't been abandoned. And what does the French Revolution develop? Well, what the French Revolution develops is administration. Administration is a very recent institution, extremely recent. Historically, administration did not exist. It is a product of the French Revolution. And what was the aim of the administration during the French Revolution? To be an executive power not subject to the law. It was necessary to do away with all the rules, all the laws, all the traditions, all the customs in order to completely homogenize France. And for that, it was necessary to create an enormous apparatus of political power. Tocqueville has some wonderful quotes on this topic. And there's another very interesting author named Eduardo Garcia de Enteria, who also discusses, he's really good for studying the whole area of administration. So, of course, suddenly an executive power has been created that is not subject to any kind of authority. In Spain, for example, this is called the principle of self-protection of the administration. What does that mean? That any act carried out by the administration is presumed to be valid. I mean, think about it. At no point in history has it ever been considered possible for political power to act without consequences, without moral reproach, without the possibility of being excommunicated, right? So, look, I'm going to tell you another one of my favorite anecdotes. In the 11th century, there was the investiture controversy, which was about who would appoint the bishops in the Holy Roman Empire. And there were Gregory VII as Pope and Charles IV, I think, of the empire, right? And Charles IV couldn't think of anything else but to depose the Pope. He goes with his army and deposes him. And the Pope makes a declarative act. He doesn't use force, he makes a declarative act. What is the declarative act? Excommunication. He performs an act in which he excommunicates the future emperor. This is very powerful. It's an act purely of authority. But of course, the German princes didn't pay homage to Charles IV because he was handsome. They paid homage to him because he was a Catholic monarch. The moment he is excommunicated, all the revolts begin and everyone starts getting nervous. And just think how incredible it is that a future emperor has to go and ask the Pope for forgiveness so that he can be readmitted into the church. The Pope gives him the penance of spending 3 days barefoot in the snow. And there you have an emperor, 3 days barefoot in the snow, fulfilling his penance to return to the church. Just think about what we're talking about here. This relationship between authority and power is just astonishing. And with the administration, you have the opposite situation. The administration can do whatever it wants and it will be presumed valid. Later on, there have been developments, which are the developments corresponding to the rule of law. And what is the rule of law? It's the attempt to control absolutism. But of course, it's the attempt to control absolutism by the state itself. So I usually say that this is like Baron Munchausen. I don't know if you know him. He's a man who tries to get out of a lake by pulling himself up by his own ponytail. He's in the sand, in the quicksand, and he tries to get out by pulling himself up by his ponytail. Well, that's not how you get out, right? It's the same with the state. The authority can't control the authorities if they're being controlled by itself, right? So in some way, this ends up being a fiction that in very few cases actually proves effective. And all the subsequent development of administrative law, trying to subject the administration to the law, well, it just makes me laugh, you know? And I think that what we're experiencing now is, for the first time, the limitation of the sovereignty of the states. And that's what's interesting about Bitcoin, isn't it? This is where Bitcoin comes in, because otherwise we could just keep talking about this. What is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin can be explained in a very, very, very simple way, right? Let's first look at the property registry for real estate, right? If I want to transfer the ownership of a property to someone else, what I have to do is sign a deed and have it registered at the registry. With that, I will change the ownership of the property. What is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is talked about in two ways, right? Bitcoin with a capital B and Bitcoin with a lowercase b. Bitcoin with a capital B is the property registry of Bitcoin with a lowercase b, which are digital coins that are in the registry, right? When I want to change the ownership of these coins, I have to do the same thing. Sign a deed, which is a transaction to send those coins to another person or whatever. Of course, what happens is that what I use to sign this transaction is a private key. And the private key is nothing more than the derivative of a set of words, which are known as a seed. This, in such an abstract way, doesn't seem like much, right? I mean, okay, fine. So what happens is that this property registry depends on so many people that in reality, it doesn't depend on anyone. It's a decentralized property registry. And since to transfer ownership in this registry, all I have to do is sign a transaction with some keys, what has been achieved is incredible. What it has done is change the concept of ownership. It has made ownership dependent on knowledge. Throughout history, all ownership has depended on violence, on the violence capable of defending it, right? If I have my army in Spain, then my army, my police, and so on will try to enforce my ownership in Spain. But if tomorrow Spain is overrun by France, my property is worthless because that registry will be controlled by another country and by other kinds of things, and they will impose their rules by force. The same has happened throughout all of human history. Throughout all of human history, ownership has depended on violence. For the first time in history, thanks to Bitcoin, ownership depends solely on knowledge. And this is a massive leap because it means taking ownership out of the tyranny of violence. But of course, by doing this, what you're doing is enormous. What you're doing is creating absolute ownership. And Hobbes in Leviathan, which is precisely a book that theorizes about the construction of the state in the 17th century, right? How all of that is constituted, what parts it has, how it works. In chapter 29, he talks about the causes that tend toward the dissolution of the state, but of the state properly understood, the state understood as that form of sovereign juridical political organization that no longer follows a tradition of judges, but whose will is the law. That what tends to dissolve that. The state, he says, if citizens have absolute ownership over their property, the state disappears because it can neither administer justice among its subjects nor finance its wars and its violence. Notice that Hobbes was no fool. He was precisely able to see what could be the cause that tended toward the dissolution of the state, right? The cause that tended to be able to put an end to that state sovereignty, to make the word of the state matter at all. Notice, if we've said that what Bitcoin does is change ownership and make it absolute, well, that's precisely what Hobbes was talking about, right? Let me give an example. I can store my wealth in Bitcoin. What I have to keep safe is just a set of words. It could be 12 words, for example, right? If I pass these 12 words on to my heirs, the state has no idea that I have transferred that. If I cross the border with those 12 words, no one knows that I own that property. I have property without limits. But if someone wants to take that property from me, if they don't know about it, they can't. But even if they do know, they can't notify a judge and tell the judge, take this property away from him. If I don't want to give up those words, they can't take them from me. And that would mean completely changing the legal systems if they wanted to try to force this. In other words, we would have to go beyond any limit that has been known so far by the state, right? So of course the question is, okay, this is pretty extreme, right? But then what comes next, right? Because if what we're facing is a crisis of the state, a crisis of the state for several reasons, what could be organized afterwards? What could be prepared afterwards? Well, to really understand this phenomenon of a crisis of the state, we have to understand why the state arises in the first place, right? We need to understand what gives rise to the state, what sustains it, and why that is now disappearing. No, what gives rise to the state are the civil wars of religion in Europe. That is what put the countries which were part of a community, the Christian world was conceived as an almost universal community, into conflict, divided between Protestants and Catholics, in a massive civil war across all of Europe. And someone had to restore order there. And the order that was established was the order of the monopoly on violence. The parties will have to give up their share of violence, their weapons, in favor of the state. Of course, how does this process take place? Well, in this process, gunpowder is essential. Gunpowder is fundamental throughout the entire process. Notice that gunpowder weapons began to appear in the 9th or 10th century. They weren't even conceived as what we now think of as gunpowder weapons. At first, they had medicinal uses, and later, gunpowder weapons were almost like fireworks, right? They would tie little bags of gunpowder to the necks of birds or attach bags of gunpowder to tree trunks and then launch them, propelling them toward the enemy. Later on, the process evolved. They would use a tube, put a bit of gunpowder and some objects inside, and launch them at the enemy. These were called fire lances. But from there to the development of cannons, centuries would pass. But of course, when you see the walls of Constantinople fall, when you see the French heavy cavalry defeated by the great captain in Naples in 1503 because of the use of gunpowder weapons, that's when you realize that something is changing. That the walled cities that used to protect us and allowed us to have small towns are no longer functional. That the cavalry armies we once had no longer guarantee our property, our safety, or our peace of mind. That we need permanent, professional, homogeneous armies equipped with gunpowder weapons. And that is what shapes the state. The state is precisely that homogenization, that structuring, that permanent army, sovereign over a territory, right? And what allows the state to survive after the religious wars in Europe? Well, what makes it possible is the industrial era. The Industrial Revolution is what sustains that Leviathan that was created, preventing it from collapsing. And why does it sustain it? Well, it sustains it because in the industrial era, production was very closely tied to the territory, and the state was the monopolist in providing security within that territory. So it's fantastic because you need raw materials, you need to make very large investments in fixed capital, and you need secure trade routes. Well, as the monopolist of violence, I'm going to protect you from all of that. Labor movements, any worker who tries to boycott you, and any bandit in exchange for a piece of the pie. You're going to give me a share of the profits, and in return, I'll protect you. Fantastic. The state is very effective at that, so efficiency didn't really matter. It could do it. It was the only one capable of providing that security, so it could take as big a piece of the pie as it wanted, right? Of course. So where do the phenomena that start to significantly affect the state begin? Well, on one hand, a new domain emerges where the state has no sovereignty. The state is structured as a territorial political entity. There is no sovereignty over the seas. There is no sovereignty over the seas. And not all states have control over their airspace, but they do have control over their territory. What happens if a new domain appears where states have no sovereignty at all? That domain is cyberspace. In cyberspace, states have no sovereignty. And here I recommend that you all read a wonderful text, which is the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow. In this text, it lays out precisely all the subsequent developments that have been observed, that have evolved over time. Honestly, it's amazing because it's a text from 1996 and it's incredible, isn't it? The understanding he already had of what this whole domain was, right? Notice that even back in 1996, the great thinkers were already talking about cyberspace as a new domain. NATO didn't recognize cyberspace as a new domain until 2014. So here you always have to, keep up, right? Well, what they're pointing out is exactly that, isn't it? It's how in cyberspace, no, since there's a completely asymmetric war, the state can't impose its will. It can't, because if there's even a single cyber criminal who's better than its 1,000 cyber officials, then that cyber criminal is going to win. Because the war there is asymmetric. It's not about efficiency. It's not about I'm the biggest, I'm the strongest, I crush everyone. No, it doesn't work like that. So, what role does Bitcoin play in all this? Well, Bitcoin precisely brings this to light. Anyone who learns to use Bitcoin can see, verify, and demonstrate how the state has no sovereignty over their property because it's in cyberspace. And of course, when you realize this, it blows your mind because, in fact, all previous forms of property have been subject to some kind of violence, and suddenly there's one that isn't, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. And that's incredible. And seeing it, living it, experiencing it, learning it, it's a wonderful process. Of course, if we suddenly say that the state is in crisis, that new domains are emerging, that new things are appearing, how can we reconfigure the state? Because in the end, the state is nothing more than a specific political form. It's a historical form. And if it's historical, then at some point it will be surpassed and will end up in the backbone of history along with other historical forms, right? There are no more city-states, the Roman Republic is gone, and practically speaking, empires have disappeared. The Hispanic monarchy no longer exists. There are no Italian lordships. The Hanseatic League doesn't exist anymore. The political forms that have existed throughout history, well, now the state is hegemonic, but that doesn't mean it always will be. So, what kind of legal political forms could we move toward? Well, first of all, in my view, we need to look at how that authority and power have come into crisis and how they are being redefined to see what they might lead to, right? What new political forms could arise from the new relationships between power and authority? So, on the one hand, regarding power, I think the main crises stem from this lack of authority and power in cyberspace on the part of the state, even as cyberspace becomes increasingly important and relevant. That is to say, more and more companies are there, more and more economic transactions take place there, more and more information, knowledge, and exchanges happen there, and yet the state no longer provides security there. There, the state is no longer able to provide security to its citizens as it did in the industrial era. There, it is no longer able to say, yes, I will. I will solve it. If someone comes to attack you, I will guarantee your trade route, and in exchange, I'll take a cut. No, now it still takes a cut, but it no longer provides that security, right? So that's the problem. The problem is that we are leaving behind the industrial era and moving into a new era, a digital era, an era of information, a new era in which there is a new predominant domain, especially in the economic and social spheres. Of course, there are two other aspects, in my opinion, that are crucial, although this also comes from academic literature and sounds very, very geeky, very strange, but within US military doctrine, it's very dominant that we are in the second nuclear era. The second nuclear era sounds very catastrophic, but it's not really that bad. It's simply about applying a bit of logic to the evolution that has taken place, right? In the first nuclear era, we had a situation where there were mainly two actors, right? These were the Soviet Union and the United States, who needed to have enough nuclear warheads to destroy each other. And in that way, if one launched an attack against the other, since each knew the other had so many nuclear warheads that they wouldn't be able to destroy all of them in a single strike, there would be retaliation. So there was a balance. There was a balance. That balance is the peace we live in today. That is to say, probably the longest period of peace in history, right? A process in which there have practically been no global or major wars. This has been thanks to the balance maintained by mutually assured destruction, knowing that if you attack, you will face retaliation, right? Now, what happens? When more players are added to the nuclear stage, that balance is no longer maintained, because if you only have Russia and the United States, but then you add China, China is going to increase its nuclear arsenal. And if China is going to increase its nuclear arsenal, the United States has to prepare for a possible attack from both Russia and China, in which it is not destroyed and can retaliate against both of them simultaneously as well. So if the United States increases its nuclear arsenal, Russia has to increase its nuclear arsenal too. Interestingly, this process has happened because of nuclear disarmament, right? Because the United States and Russia have greatly reduced their number of arsenals or nuclear warheads, right? And this has allowed arsenals that were previously irrelevant to now start becoming relevant, because scenarios are emerging where it might actually be worthwhile to use nuclear weapons, right? And this leads to a much more unstable scenario. Why is that? Well, for example, because there's also a rivalry between Pakistan and India. And if Pakistan has nuclear weapons, then India has to increase its nuclear arsenal. But if India has to increase its nuclear arsenal, then China has to increase its nuclear arsenal. And if China has to increase its nuclear arsenal, then India has to increase its nuclear arsenal again, and so does Pakistan, right? And this keeps feeding back on itself. And if China increases its nuclear arsenal, then the United States does too, right? So where is this second nuclear era heading? Well, towards a proliferation of nuclear weapons. And what happens to those states that are not able to have nuclear weapons? Are they able to guarantee their territorial integrity and the security of their cities? Well, judging by what's happening in Ukraine, it seems not. The state, due to the nuclear emergency, as well as the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the instability in that nuclear scenario, also loses a great deal of power, right? It loses the power that without nuclear weapons, you are not able to deter invasions, and therefore you won't be sovereign either. And real sovereignty is now being limited to very few states, isn't it? There's another phenomenon, which is outer space. Outer space is yet another domain, along with cyberspace, land, sea, and air, where there are also many geopolitical actors and from which power can be projected. Telecommunications are maintained from there, and we have companies operating there. But which states are actually capable of providing or projecting power in cyberspace? Very few, very few. In fact, they have to hire foreign companies, right? Ukraine, a country in the middle of a war, suffers an attack in outer space by Russia, loses its satellites, and has to hire Starlink, a private company. Could we really call that sovereignty? Is that truly absolute control over your territory? I think this is already a completely diluted form of sovereignty, isn't it? And it's becoming clear that this can't go much further, right? But there's also another thing, isn't there, which is a scenario where war becomes multi-domain. So you have to be able to project power across all domains simultaneously and in a coordinated way, right? And in this context, the massive permanent armies with huge infrastructures, big planes, aircraft carriers, and so on are not as effective as swarms. Swarms of drones, swarms of units, swarms that are organized and coordinated across all domains. Because maybe what you need are agents controlling cyberspace and coordination. You need satellites providing telecommunications, drones operating in the air, tanks moving on the ground, and highly specialized infantry units carrying out assaults. And that doesn't fit well with what has traditionally been the specialty of the state. It's the large scale, permanent, and efficient army. This fits much better with forms of political organization, with personalized security, because what we need now is no longer total security, since the state is no longer able to provide it. What we need now is to tailor security needs very precisely to each region, right? And that's on the side of power. But when it comes to authority, there's another issue. Authority, as I mentioned at the beginning, is socially recognized knowledge, right? And this isn't just a figure of speech, is it? It has its foundation. Those institutions that are able to channel information are the ones that can possess the best knowledge and transmit it to the citizens and the population. And if they are the ones capable of transmitting it, who will the public perceive as the authority? Well, those authorities. We had the monasteries, which were the ones that transmitted knowledge, essential knowledge. Why? They copied books and possessed the know-how of how to plant, how to care for, how to cultivate the plants, and how to harvest them. They were the ones who carried the seeds, the ones who held all the knowledge in addition to moral authority. At the moment the printing press appears, are monasteries still necessary to transmit that knowledge? What happens to that regional authority they had? It disappears. What happens with the state now? Let's remember that the state absorbs the authority of the church and channels it mainly through several institutions, right? On one hand, there are the media, on another, the universities, and on yet another, the state itself as such. Political institutionalization also reflects authority, doesn't it? Of course, since the state as such is losing authority because of these new fronts opening up, it has a problem there. But there's another problem, which is that the media are experiencing a fork, they're undergoing a split. Young people no longer consume media, we don't watch television, read newspapers, we don't consume those media outlets that are linked to the state. What we consume are sources of information and knowledge on the internet. And this also affects universities. Universities have to adapt because the knowledge being generated now isn't in books or in their libraries, it's on the internet, and they have to adapt to that. They need to be able to institutionalize that knowledge, which is being generated in a massive cloud all over the world. And that means doing things like this, right? Hold specific seminars with those people who are creating that knowledge so they can share it, because otherwise it's very difficult for the university to keep going by presenting a PowerPoint they've been using for 20 years. Maybe that's fine for explaining Kant or Aristotle, but not for teaching the new knowledge that will actually help you make a living. So that also affects the lack of authority of universities. And that's a problem. And for the professors as well, because students can question what the professor is saying in real time, or they can just ask ChatGPT. That's a problem. What other problems do we have? Well, of course, since authority has been fragmented, who is creating that knowledge now? That knowledge is being created out in the world. That socially recognized knowledge, that authority is now being taken on by business leaders, influencers, and great thinkers. These are what I have called charismatic authorities. Max Weber already addressed this, didn't he? And others as well. But those are charismatic authorities. They are people who participate in the creation of new orders. They are establishing order in certain fields, and as a result, they gain charisma and therefore authority. So we are currently facing a significant crisis of power and also a profound crisis of authority. We are indeed faced with a pressing need for personalized security solutions, and we are clearly seeing the emergence of entirely new authorities that are no longer strictly state-based, but are in fact quite capable of uniting millions upon millions of devoted followers. And from the convergence of these two elements, the new forms of political organization should arise, which in my view are personalized jurisdictions that I have called micropolises. What does this mean? Well, this might seem very odd, it might seem very strange, but it's nothing more than bringing back those population charters. The difference is that they would be updated to the present day, not going back to the past as the rosters of Bologna mistakenly did, right? But rather creating something new, something completely new. So what would these kinds of personalized jurisdictions consist of? Well, there could be many different kinds, right? Because in the end, since they're going to be personalized, there will be many more than we can even imagine. But something as simple as, hey, we're really loyal followers of some influencer. I usually give an example that's pretty controversial. That kind of stirs things up a bit. Let's imagine we're fans of Elon Musk, and Elon Musk, who gets along very well with Millie, says, look, I'm fed up with US regulations. I'm fed up. I don't think they're capable of guaranteeing my personal safety, so I want to create a personalized jurisdiction in Argentina, 500 square kilometers, under which to establish a new form of political organization that will not be part of Argentine sovereignty. Because what we're going to try to do, what needs to be overcome, is this idea of modern sovereignty. That's what's in crisis. And without overcoming this idea of modern sovereignty, we won't be able to create new forms of political organization, right? So let's suppose Argentina has some economic needs, right? I can just make up $100 billion. Milei's Argentina needs $100 billion to be able to, well, I don't know, maybe overcome a delicate economic situation or make some significant investments. And it offers Elon Musk the following, right? He says, okay, I'll offer you 500 square kilometers, which I have in abundance. I've got plenty. I have a ton of empty land for $100 billion. And since now the most valuable thing is no longer factories, but rather human capital, those people who are able to add value at the margin, I want you to set up an academy to train Argentinians in new technologies, okay? And I want you to hire a percentage of Argentinians in your new jurisdiction. In exchange, I'll provide you with some kind of security. If you need to supply yourself with certain goods or food or whatever, we can trade without any problem with the jurisdiction. We create a new social contract. You will have a set of conditions in that micropolis, in that personalized jurisdiction, and I will have other obligations. For example, I can't invade you. You can't engage in drug trafficking, but for the rest, hey, if you want to launch 50,000 SpaceX satellites there, go ahead, there's no problem. Okay, so basically, whatever you want, freedom. You do whatever you want and organize yourself legally and politically however you like. Maybe you don't have to set up a democracy. Maybe you could establish a Greek-style democracy in the sense that only certain types of people have certain political rights, right? And what could Elon do, for example? Well, Elon could say, okay, the 100,000 people who donate $1 million to me are the only 100,000 people who will have political rights in this territory. They will have the right to vote, to participate, to make decisions about this new micropolis. It would cost Elon Musk nothing. Argentina would gain human capital, massive investments, and hiring in the world's leading companies, in addition to attracting all of that. And Elon creates a personalized jurisdiction that is no longer subject to all the absurd regulations of the United States. He can provide his own security, and 100,000 people can move there and establish whatever immigration rules they want, whatever requirements they want, whatever conditions they want, whatever security they want, whatever legal norms they want, whatever taxes they want, right? Because this is also an extremely important issue. The difference between a tribute and a tax. When does the tax appear? Why do I say when does the tax appear? Because the tax has not always been a tax. Historically, what has existed logically is that any political community has expenses, common expenses, right? Because that's what a political community is for. A political community is created to pursue the common good. And the common good is not the same as individual good. The common good is the good of the political community. And the good of the political community, well, it comes with expenses and costs that need to be covered. How has this been done historically? With tributes. The tributes that needed to be paid were determined, and that was it. But tributes were negotiated. Why? Because there was no absolute power. Since there was no absolute power, they had to negotiate. An emperor like Charles first had to travel around the Spanish courts to negotiate the tributes he would be paid. Why? Because the citizens were armed, because the charters and political communities were armed, right? Of course, so what happens? That at the moment the state appears and becomes the monopolist of violence, citizens no longer have weapons. And since they don't have weapons, tributes can be imposed on them. When did this happen? Well, it's very interesting because it's related to part of the situation I mentioned, right? And it also involves a very important thinker. It's Machiavelli. I mentioned earlier that there was a conflict, well, the invasion of Naples by Charles the Rush with the Great Captain. It's the first battle in which the French heavy cavalry army suffers a crushing defeat. And they suffer it because the Great Captain incorporated infantry with gunpowder weapons, right? The tercios. Of course, just imagine Machiavelli, who was the chancellor of the Signoria of Florence, which was the main city, right? How he sees gunpowder weapons destroying those who used to destroy them. The cavalry. So the fear that grips Machiavelli is so great that he realizes that unless he carries out a general tax reform, which is what it's called, and imposes massive taxes to form a permanent and professional army, they are going to be wiped out. That's the origin. And that's precisely the moment. Why was Machiavelli able to do it? Well, because the lordships are a very specific form of political organization that emerged as a result of an event, right? And it's also very relevant, as I've mentioned, that this was the investiture controversy, this conflict that was going on. There was a great ruler involved, Matilda of Canossa. Matilda of Canossa was right in the north of Italy. So it was there that all these exchanges between the papacy and the empire took place. All the conflicts, all the wars, everything happened there, right? And she sided with the papacy. In fact, when I mentioned the story about spending 3 days barefoot in the snow, that happened at Matilda of Canosa's castle. That's called the humiliation of Canosa. That's the event. Of course, what is it that happened with Matilda? Matilda was so great, she founded more than 100 cities. I mean, she was an extraordinary woman, probably the most important woman of that century and a good part of the Middle Ages. She was so important that upon her death, the son of Charles IV, Charles XV, well, I think Charles XV didn't actually succeed him. I think it was someone else who did, named her the emperor's vicar, and that was a great honor. But upon her death, it was declared that there could be no successors in government. So more than 100 cities were left without rulers because she was so great that the idea was, hey, no one will be able to replace this woman, right? So a process of civil war began within those cities in northern Italy. Why? Because there were factions in conflict, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, the supporters of the papacy and the supporters of the empire. And of course, how were these civil wars in the cities of northern Italy resolved? With the condottieri. The condottieri, in the end, were nothing more than mercenaries, but mercenary now has a word. It has a pejorative connotation, but at that time it didn't. They were noble families who would take on the government of those cities, hired under a contract, and would monopolize the use of arms. Why would they monopolize it? Because it was the only way for both sides, who were engaged in civil war, to lay down their arms. If that event hadn't happened, Machiavelli wouldn't have been able to implement, that is, to carry out that general tax reform of imposing taxes, because he was in a situation where the citizens had already given up their arms. So notice how important that is. Of course, all of this, how do we reconfigure those personalized jurisdictions, right? Like what could give us enormous power against the state to do that? Well, just like in the Middle Ages, the crossbow was extremely important. Why? Because the crossbow allowed peasants to protect themselves from certain feudal lords, certain abusers, and so on, because it greatly reduced the cost of defending oneself against, say, a knight. Well, now we have Bitcoin, right? And what is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin in the end is being able to have property outside the reach of the law, being able to own something that the state cannot take away from you. And this is what gives us back our bargaining power. Bitcoin can be very well understood as a weapon, a defensive weapon like the crossbow. In fact, there's an article I really like by Chuck Hamill called From Crossbows to Cryptography. Precisely because of that, right? Because it's a quantum leap in the ability to defend your wealth. Whereas before, to protect your wealth, you needed weapons. In other words, you just need to stay quiet. You don't need anything else, right? Then that's something I think can give us a lot of bargaining power to negotiate with certain states. Hey, if you want my wealth, offer me better conditions, offer me a personalized jurisdiction, let's reach an agreement on taxes, let's create a new social contract and establish new jurisdictions. I think this is going to start proliferating in a very significant way, and we'll see how it evolves, but I believe it's a huge opportunity. And this means bringing political territory into the exchange. Historically, there have been exchanges of political territory. Political territories have been sold left and right, Alaska, for example, but there have been many others, right? Of course, that was limited to governments, to states. The thing is, now there are charismatic authorities with much more power, influence, and followers than states. And they could be the agents who start this. And why is that? Well, because what the internet allows us to do is precisely this, to aggregate all the demand in order to create a personalized offer. And that's the big change of this era, right? In my opinion, that's the major shift that the internet brings. In the industrial era, to sell, you had to produce on a massive scale in a homogeneous way and flood the market with goods. You couldn't adjust supply to demand because you didn't know what the demand would be. And that's a huge uncertainty. You didn't have all those people identified and visible, right? I see this, for example, in the publishing world. To sell books, you had to produce books on a massive scale and put them on the shelves, and well, then a bunch would end up being thrown away, and that was it, right? Now it's different. Now you build a personal brand, books are produced on demand by publishers, and you sell as you go. That's it. You can match supply to demand very well, find your niche, and you can create a personalized offer. Of course, I think the business opportunity is so big that the possibility of making personalized territorial offers is enormous, really. It's wonderful. And what I like most about this is that it brings back an essential concept for politics, which is the concept of political freedom. What the state does precisely in order to impose itself is to eliminate all the intermediate orders. What the administration did during the French Revolution was to eliminate all the intermediate orders, the guilds, the estates, everything that existed. What sovereignty did in Spain was to abolish the fueros. What the Bourbons did in Spain was exactly that, to abolish the fueros. So in such a way that the state is left alone facing the individual, and an individual, well, is not going to create a new legal order. There are no intermediate orders, So what needs to be done is to rebuild them, to recompose them. And that is extremely important. Why? Because participation in politics is essential to living a good life. This is Aristotle. In other words, we can't get away from that. Participation in politics is essential, but participation in political life is not just about casting a vote in the ballot box every 4 years. That has nothing to do with seeking the best possible life for all citizens. That is what political activity is about, isn't it? For that to be possible, we need to recover political freedom, which is the freedom to be able to found new political communities. And if we don't pursue that goal, I think it will be very difficult to leave behind the state of corruption in the states. Now, not everyone is going to do it. It's not going to be an instant process, but I do think it will happen, and it will probably happen in this century, right? Because as it becomes clear that states are increasingly in a situation where they don't protect, don't provide security, don't guarantee property rights, take a very, very large share of the wealth, don't provide services, and are unable to modernize or keep up, more people will push for change and move to better jurisdictions. So there will come a time when a state sees the opportunity and starts offering personalized jurisdictions. And Naval Ravikant put it on Twitter in 2019 in a way that I really liked, right? That the future is a sea of failed socialist states surrounded by free cities.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. Really fascinating. I have several questions, but before that, I wanted to open the floor to the audience in case any of our attendees have a question they'd like to ask Alvaro. Before doing that, I'd also like to emphasize that this session of the seminar, our first WF seminar in Spanish, is being recorded. And I also forgot to mention that Alvaro is, a prolific writer, right? He has two very good books, right? And I think he'll have more in his lifetime. One is called Philosophy of Bitcoin, and it takes a philosophical journey through the political theory that underpins or has underpinned violence. And I believe, Alvaro, correct me if I'm wrong, Micropolis is already published.
It will be out soon.
Ah, perfect. So now it's also where he develops these ideas he's talked to us about regarding the power of the local, right? So, well, if any of our participants wants to ask a question, they can also write it in the chat if they'd like, right? And I have a few while our audience decides raising their hand if they want. Honestly, thank you, Alvaro, because your talk, your presentation in this seminar leaves a lot of, on one hand, statements, right, about how reality is shifting. And that's why I think the work of universities has to do, on one hand, with explaining, right, to better understand the phenomena that are happening. But on the other hand, as you said, also to provide those tools, professional, technical, pragmatic, if you'll allow me the term, if I can use that expression, to give them those cognitive skills, right, to our students. So this explanation about where the state is heading, I do think I agree with you, right? And I think it's a very good explanation of that crisis of the state, that more and more, right? Daniel Bell used to say it's too small for the big problems in life and too big for the small ones, right? But also, how do we create this space of community sovereignty, of the municipality as an intermediate society in an environment that here in Latin America is falling apart, except in some cities and so on, right? But there is indeed a retreating state, and that's very evident. But at the same time, the state still has this capacity for the monopoly on violence and a credible threat, right? If you don't pay your taxes, well, there are sanctions, right? Which could even end up costing you your personal freedom, right? Ending up in jail. And there's also the matter of how to find these forms of intermediate political organization, right? Perhaps outside the bounds of the state, right? As you said, well, it's outside the law. And that maybe you can explain that to us too, but the way I understand it, it's not illegal, but rather the state simply doesn't reach there, right?
Exactly, exactly. I mean, no, it's not because it's illegal, because it's not, but because it just has nothing to say about it, right?
Exactly, it has nothing to say about it.
It's a property without laws, or rather that, I mean, it's a new kind of property, a new form of property organization.
Hey, and in that sense, I mean, let's see, in this thing about how, I mean, what to do, right? I think the explanation is really interesting. But well, Bitcoin is a defensive weapon, right? But how do you see this process? How can we explain it where you use some technologies, these technologies that are kind of low tech with Bitcoin, which is a defensive weapon to start creating these municipalities, right? I mean, do we have to go all the way to Miley and Musk, or can we do something in between?
I like the case of Millet and Musk because they're like the extreme cases, right? Lately, I really like this idea of heuristics, of having heuristic ideas that that give you a bit of direction, that show you a bit of the path to follow, you know? I don't think Argentina and Musk will be the first countries to do it, precisely because Argentina is a very sovereigntist country. But that's exactly what makes it go viral, because every time I say something about this, thousands and thousands of Argentinians quote me angrily, and so my ideas reach a lot more people, you know? That's kind of the strategy. But I do think that yes, they're going to start to appear, you see, in multiple ways, right? First of all, I think this could happen through communities that already share a common worldview, right? For example, let's imagine a certain group of friends with certain abilities, with certain things, who want to move to a village and live by their own rules and under their own conditions, right? Basically, what they'll have to do is start reconfiguring the order around them to fit their needs and preferences. Of course, the issue here is that there is indeed a certain need for negotiation with the states, right? I'm not asking for anything more than that. What I'm asking for is to open up a process of, hey, let's stop having things imposed on us, right? Look at how well Tocqueville put it. Tocqueville said, the French Revolution did not put an end to privileges. It simply monopolized all of them on one side, on the side of the state, and left everyone else as, well, as absolute subjects, right? So I think that, in other words, all the privileges have been monopolized. That's what Tocqueville was getting at. I think that's a bit of what we get back, right? Which in a way is, hey, state, don't treat me like a subject, treat me as an equal, because I have something you want and you can't take it from me unless it's by some other means or by my own will, right? So let's sit down and negotiate, even out of self interest, right? That's actually what I would focus on the most, because I think that's where this really makes sense, right? So what has value today? Today, what has value is adding value at the margin, if you'll pardon the redundancy, right? That is, it's not about producing at massive scale in a homogeneous way, but rather, well, I'm just a little bit better, right? Which AI do we use? Well, the AI that's just a little bit better. So that AI you use, which is a little bit better, is also used by billions of people. And that's what ultimately adds a lot of value at the margin, right? Of course, these are no longer factories. They're not that kind of thing anymore, right? This is a different kind of thing now. That's human capital. The ones who develop these kinds of things are human capital. So what states need in order to keep going is human capital. They need to attract human capital. And the best way to attract human capital is by creating specific personalized conditions so that human capital will come, right? What could be easier than doing that, right? I mean, I see it very similarly to how the Christian kings issued settlement charters. Hey, we need to win this race. We need to win this competition. What tools do we have? Look, we're clinging to the idea of sovereignty, but the idea of sovereignty is killing us. The idea of having absolute control over the territory just isn't functional anymore. It worked in another era, but it doesn't work anymore. It's no longer valid. If we could create new settlement charters, if we could create customized jurisdictions, maybe we could attract a lot of human economic business and knowledge capital that would allow us to move forward again. Just look at the boost that settlement charters and the Reconquista gave to Spain, right? In the end, it became an empire even larger than practically anywhere we could imagine now. So, how that momentum comes from a new legal political worldview. Well, I think that if a state starts to bring together customized jurisdictions, I think it's going to have a huge advantage over the rest, because in the end, it will have people who are comfortable, who want to maintain what they have, who want to protect it, who want to safeguard it, and who won't be thinking about leaving. On the contrary, they'll be thinking about expanding that customized jurisdiction, right? That is for it to grow, for more people to come and be better off, right? And that, well, is also more value for the states, isn't it? So I think that's how the relationship is going to be here. And going back to Milei, Milei met Huerta de Soto, who is the one who gave him all his ideas, because a man started recording Huerta de Soto's classes and uploaded them to YouTube, and Milei watched them. Well, I think we should do something similar. Just focus on spreading these ideas, and there will come a time when a leader will want to implement them. And I don't think that moment is very far off. I've had these ideas for a long time, and my idea was, well, as if there were a kind of marketplace where jurisdictions could be offered, right? And this seemed to me like the best way to put it into practice. And I'm lucky that now I'm an advisor at a company called Citizen X, which doesn't sell jurisdictions, but what they do sell is citizenships. And if someone had said this a decade ago, people would have called it absolute madness. How could states literally sell their citizenships on a marketplace, right? I mean, it sounds absolutely impossible, right? The process is online. You don't even have to be there in person. You just pay and they give you the country's passport, right? And this is already happening. I mean, it already exists. It's not just a theory. It's not a hypothesis. It's nothing like that. We're talking about Trump trying to launch the Trump card is $5 million to get US citizenship, United States. It's just that things are moving really fast now. And in the end, what does this mean? All this really means is there are people in a state who want to leave those states for others. The states see opportunities there by selling their nationality, so they do it because it's an opportunity. When the idea of modern sovereignty is surpassed, what will be put on the market in exchange for political territory? Because the interesting thing here isn't that they're selling you a house. What's interesting is that you can create whatever legal and political order you want with conditions, with negotiations. I'm not saying that this is, well, I'll just set up a jurisdiction for drugs and no, it doesn't have to be that, okay? Conditions can be set for a new social contract that regulates the relationship between the personalized jurisdiction and the state by both parties, and mechanisms of guarantees can be established. And here, Bitcoin is also very useful.
Agreed. Yes, no. In fact, we're going to start seeing things we've never imagined before. Maybe for the colleagues who are listening to us who are younger, this feels a bit more natural to them. For those of us who studied law a couple of decades ago, this was unthinkable, right? I mean, everything was written within a constitutional order. Let me tell you, I still work at the Supreme Court of Justice of Mexico, which is, well, I mean, the pinnacle, right, of the state's authority, isn't it? The one you were referring to, that is the one that ultimately gives legal legitimacy to the country's laws. And, well, we're coming from a judicial reform where on September 1st, everything is going to be completely reconfigured. And I also think that, well, this authority is going to be broken, right? I mean, if it was already in crisis in the last decade, now I think it's going to be a major rupture. So I do expect to see in Mexico, not that I'm trying to make it happen or anything like that, just from an academic interest and a theoretical expectation, many more phenomena like the ones you mentioned. We're already seeing them, it's just that we don't know how to express or verbalize them, right? And so we see that when the state withdraws, there are arrangements. Well, organized crime is terrible, right? But then there's also community life, isn't there? There's a southern state here in Mexico called Oaxaca, which has 500 municipalities. And so yesterday I was having lunch with a colleague from the court who is actually from one of those municipalities, and he was explaining to me all the structures of authority that have remained for hundreds of years, even with the Mexican state. And the Mexican state kind of fit in there, but it's still present. They call it the Catholic Association, right? Which is kind of like a parish commissioner, but also acts as a mediator in conflicts, right? And then, well, there are also all the organizers of the patron saint festivals, but in reality, they also have political roles and so on, right? So that's where that community life exists, right?
I had a professor who used to say, what a coincidence that Kelsen chose the image of the pyramid for his theory of law, because the pyramid is a funerary element.
That's a good one, yeah, isn't it? And I think it's going to be a tomb very soon, right? I mean, yes, no, I completely agree that this whole pyramid thing, we need to rethink law from a polycentric point of view, right? And well, the historical perspective you give us is fundamental. One last question I have, right? So, as not to take up too much of your time, Alvaro, do you see, for example, in this, you have the Teutonic Knights very much in mind, right? Who sometimes were a kind of condottieri as well, right? They were hired to, well, to bring order to certain territories, especially in the Slavic world and Eastern Europe. Do you see that happening now? I mean, there are organizations that say, look, I know how a municipality or locality works, hire me and I'll manage everything for you.
Absolutely. Look, I think that the first thing, I think there's a very big incentive that I haven't talked about yet, but I believe it's going to be the most important one, which is the intersection. And with robotics, I think it's going to be something as big as factories were in terms of change of mindset and everything, because suddenly we're going to have autonomous work. So, of course, those jurisdictions that encourage this are going to become immensely wealthy, and those jurisdictions that go against it are going to be completely ruined, because relatively speaking, they'll be ruined. I think that incentive to create new jurisdictions that allow autonomous work is going to be wild, absolutely wild. So, of course, I am convinced that if someone else has to organize the security of a jurisdiction, the security provided by them will be much better than anyone else's. And yes, I think certain types of companies will start to emerge that begin to offer that kind of service. And let's not think so much about military companies, but rather about insurance companies. I think that here, insurance makes much more sense. Yes, maybe behind the scenes, they're hiring armies or mercenary companies or security firms or whatever, but it's better than you directly hiring an army yourself. Because really, what's normal in society isn't for those kinds of things to suddenly happen. And if they do, at least you can be compensated in some way, either financially through repairs or by imposing penalties on others. And I think it's also very important to see this not in isolation, just from the perspective of a single jurisdiction, but rather with organizations made up of these micro jurisdictions. That is, maybe a single personalized jurisdiction doesn't have much power or much relative weight, but if there are many of them, the network effect they can create together is tremendous, especially if they are highly specialized. One might be highly specialized in medical services or pharmaceuticals, another could be more focused on robotics, artificial intelligence, or whatever else, and another might specialize in vacation resorts. When this becomes a league of jurisdictions, and if you attack one, you lose access to the services of all the others or face sanctions, it becomes much harder. It acts as a deterrent. And here, if you want something for the real enthusiasts, as a heuristic idea as well. I think what will proliferate here is nuclear sharing. That is, I believe that low-yield nuclear weapons will continue to grow. In other words, I think we will keep seeing this rise. From the Cold War until today, 9 nuclear powers have emerged. Basically, there are 8 or 9 more nuclear powers now than there were before. And I think we're going to keep seeing this proliferation of nuclear weapons, but the intensity will decrease. Instead of atomic bombs that can destroy a city, there'll be small bombs that send a signal like, hey, this is deterrence. If you attack me, I will continue to escalate with nuclear force. And I think it makes a lot of sense that these kinds of federations, organizations with personalized jurisdictions, that some of them would have this kind of nuclear sharing to deter attacks. And I want to emphasize that this could be of interest to states. In other words, this could be an idea that really appeals to states, just like those population charters. And why do I say this? Because it might seem like a crazy idea, but it's not going to happen. But let's imagine that France changed its mindset, which I insist is not going to happen. But suddenly, instead of keeping its former colonies under its control or influence, it creates personalized jurisdictions, establishes these micropolises, and in return, it forms a sort of French Commonwealth. What it does is share small nuclear weapons, which allows them to protect themselves and provides the security that the French army would otherwise have to guarantee. But now it's no longer necessary. And instead of having the US, France, and other countries with armies deployed on the other side of the world to protect certain interests or certain colonies, they could create independent administrations but with beneficial trade agreements, certain types of exchanges, and other arrangements that give rise to new political structures. That is to say, don't see this as the state is dying and we're going to scavenge it, which could also happen, but mainly, if this is going to be taken over by someone, it will be by states that see the opportunity to create these kinds of jurisdictions, and from there the movement will begin. I do think it makes a lot of sense for companies and businesses specialized in this to emerge. And I think, for example, of construction companies, resort companies, security firms, and certain other types of businesses. I see a huge advantage here because, in a way, there are already very similar things out there. I know of massive earth-moving companies. In Dubai, they're building artificial islands, and in the Emirates and all those areas. These are ideas about new political territory, expanding political territory, and creating new cities on top of that. And these are done by companies. That's right. It's wild. So, thinking about that in the context of traditional states, I think it's quite reasonable. But above all, the huge incentive here is going to be political freedom. Political freedom is an essential part of a person's development as a person. It's fundamental. And the possibility for you to determine your own legal and political order, I think that's going to inspire a tremendous desire to live, to fight, and to prosper in billions of people. I truly believe that. And that's a bit of the essence of Europe. The essence of Europe was political freedom, and that died in the 17th century.
Yes, that's right, that's right. This particular political freedom that you are discussing is the inherent freedom to establish and develop legal and political frameworks and to meticulously organize them in a truly free and unconstrained manner.
No, look, one of the things for me is, although I won't go into it in detail because it's a big topic in my book and something I really like, it's the Hanseatic League. Suddenly, a group of free cities appears, and that's what they're called. They're basically commercial ports.
That's right.
Commercial ports that trade certain types of fish and salt, and they have a bit of a monopoly there. They create certain types of ships and a private army among the cities, but these are cities from different countries, and that's the Hanseatic League. And how would you define that? That's a state. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. And they had their own army, but each city was in a different country. And that's how it was.
They also had their own diplomacy.
A very different form of legal and political organization with their own rules, their own laws, their own ways of doing things. What I want is to break free from the state mentality, from homogeneity, from hierarchy, from absolutism, from the principle of administrative neutrality, from all those kinds of things, and to reclaim the right to political freedom. So it's not much more either.
Great, Alvaro. Hey, there will be a way to continue with these topics. I am very grateful for your time and your presentation.
A real pleasure.
Thank you for opening these seminars, and we'll continue discussing these municipal issues thanks to those who joined us. We're pleased to announce that this session is also being recorded and that in a few days, maybe a week, it will also be available to everyone on social media. Thank you very much, Alvaro. Thank you all.
A pleasure.